Well, hello there, listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of the Better Than Fine podcast. I'm your host, Darlene Marshall. And when I think back over my time in the fitness and wellness space, and I think about the people who've influenced me, first I think about the mentors, the teachers, the people that when I was a little baby trainer trying to figure it all out, really pulled me in and nurtured my curiosity and helped me to grow. I think about the managers, the people who taught me how to run my business and gave me the foundational skills that have let me grow that into a career. And I think about the colleagues, the peers, the people who helped me to incubate my ideas, who challenged me, and who were fun to grow and learn with. And I hadn't really thought about the multiple generations of people who worked to bring fitness in the mainstream, especially for women. And, when I think about that a little bit deeper, I think about one of my favorite accounts to follow on Instagram is the Refugee Olympic Team. And if you don't follow them, I strongly, strongly suggest that you go look them up. Because I know that I have taken for granted living in a culture where, as a woman, I could do all kinds of things with my body and I felt empowered to do so. So, one of my favorite athletes on the Refugee Olympic Team is Masoma Ali Zada. So she made her Olympic debut in 2020 on the Refugee Olympic cycling team. She's originally from Afghanistan. And when she would ride her bike, she'd have people yell things and throw things. She'd be assaulted, pulled off of her bicycle just for being a woman riding a bike on the road. And not all that long ago, in the course of modern history, women exercising were thought to be strange. Um, Reading our guest today, her book, I learned that women were actually told not to exercise too hard because your uterus might fall out, which is just incredible to think about as a thing that we genuinely believe would happen if a woman exerted herself. It's just kind of wild. So it's really easy to take for granted the information, the equipment, the access. And my guest today knows a thing or three about all of that. She's an award-winning journalist, and she's the author of Let's Get Physical: How Women Discovered Exercise and Reshaped the World, which was selected to be one of the best books of the year for the New Yorker, Amazon, and the Financial Times. I hope she's very proud of all of that. She's written for the New York Times, Vogue, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, NBC News, and dozens and dozens and dozens of other outlets. And I'm so excited to have her here on our little show, a fellow Kelly McGonigal fangirl, Danielle Friedman. Welcome to Better Than Fine.
Hi, I am so happy to be here.
I'm so happy to have you. Welcome.
Thank you.
Let's just start with what has inspired you to write in the fitness and wellness space? Because I know as a practitioner, it was a lot of stuff about practicing fitness, but writing about those topics, I think, is an interesting career path. So let's just kick off there.
Yeah, well, it kind of took me a while in my career to come around to fitness specifically. I am a longtime health, culture, gender reporter, but I hadn't really reported on fitness until I started what I kind of see as my book journey. And for some context, that it kicked off when I started taking bar classes about 6 years ago, and I had never taken bar. I loved how strong the classes made me feel, but as a feminist journalist, I also I kind of couldn't take that hat on, and I was excuse me, that hat off, and I was just fascinated by bar's subculture and also the potential impact that the workout could have on women's sexual health, because there was a lot of focus on the pelvic area. And so I started digging, and I discovered the story of Lottie Burke, who is this fascinating figure who invented bar in the 1950s in London. She herself was actually a German Jewish refugee. She had fled her native Germany in the 30s to escape Nazi persecution. And she is a very complicated, flawed, but fascinating figure who, sure enough, had invented this workout in part to help women embrace their sexuality in pre-sexual revolution London, and connect with their physicality in a way that women really weren't doing then. So I see Lottie's story as kind of the gateway for me to this larger beat. In researching Lottie's story, which I ended up writing about for The Cut, I had a true light bulb moment where I couldn't believe that nobody had told the story of the rise of women's fitness in contemporary society. And I discovered that in so many fields of fitness and behind so many movements, there was this Lottie Burke-like or a kind of Forrest Gump-like figure. So that journey for me started many years ago now, about 6 years ago, and it hasn't stopped. And I also should say I'm a longtime runner. I have really felt personally what I have benefited so immensely from movement in so many aspects of my life, and including my emotional life and my mental health. And I'm a really, true believer in the power of movement. So that's the short version.
Yeah, I like the short version, the long version, and every version.
Mhm.
And there's a few things about that I appreciate. One, anybody who listens to the show knows that I'm going to applaud anybody who sees the power of movement beyond just the physical self. But I think you brought up something that I found very interesting in your book, which was not only the number of polarizing figures, but this tension
Mm.
between movement for empowerment, right? Like just physical empowerment in general of women, and the like feminist identity, and when that gets kind of co-opted, or is it about empowerment, or is it about how we look, or is how we look a bit of empowerment? And I think we're at a weird moment right now where these things are in tension, where in the past taking ownership of one's physical presentation was also seen as a point of empowerment, right?
Mm.
And so there's a lot there. I don't know if you have a jump off point that sparks your curiosity, but it really stood out to me in the book. And I appreciated that you didn't shy away from that tension.
Yeah, well, I really see that as the central tension of the book and of this larger story of the rise of women's fitness and physical empowerment, particularly in America and the West over the past 70 years. Um, and yeah, it was really important to me in writing the book to both celebrate these pioneers who really did, make it possible for women to move the way we move today and open so many doors, um, and whose work had this inherently feminist streak, but at the same time highlighting that it's not black or white. And many of these pioneers that I wrote about, including Lottie Burke, who I just mentioned, um, were of their time. And what that meant in many cases was that because for so long vigorous movement, sweating, muscles was seen as so kind of subversive for women, um, and this is a generous sort of interpretation, but they sold their workouts as a beauty tool, or as both. And I think some of the pioneers I write about, I know I'm speaking in generalities here, but I can get into more detail. But it was like broccoli dipped in chocolate. They strategically recognized that the public throughout so much of the 20th century would have just sort of instantly rejected the idea of working out the way that we do today to build strength and empowerment, and so they sold it as a way to hold on to your honeymoon figure. And in other cases, I think it was just so those two promises were sort of so intertwined, the pioneers themselves didn't even realize, they weren't even kind of aware of the mixed messages that they were promoting. Um, but
Well, and maybe to
yeah,
them, it didn't seem like a mixed message, right? Because they're
exactly.
also a product of their own context. And it's funny that you say it like it's past tense, because I still have this argument weekly
Mm,
about marketing within the fitness and wellness space, that we're underselling its potential if we're still selling it about aesthetics as opposed to all of the
mhm,
other benefits
mhm, mhm.
that hopefully regular listeners to this show already know about. So it's interesting to
Yeah.
me to hear about it as if it's not still happening, because you even talk about in the book, like starting to go to bar because of your wedding. I know
Mhm.
I've talked about on this show feeling the pressure to work on my aesthetics before my wedding, and we're in the space, we're looking at it, and we're still feeling it.
Yeah, and I don't mean to imply that it is past tense. I was really interested in understanding how today's current fitness landscape came to be, and how exercise and fitness and movement and aesthetics became so intertwined,
Mm.
particularly for women. And that was a really fascinating sort of scavenger hunt,
Yeah.
journey to try to sifting through the archives, just to identify some of the roots and the origins. And my belief really is that by kind of making visible these historical forces and hidden forces that have been sort of invisible to a lot of the public, we can better understand our motivations for exercising, understand the industry, and kind of uncouple those motivations.
I
So
dig that. That's to me, a very noble mission to be on. So you're listening to Better Than Fine podcast. I'm your host, Darlene Marshall. My guest is Danielle Friedman. She's the author of Let's Get Physical: How Women Discovered Exercise and Reshaped the World. And it's interesting, you just mentioned, I just yesterday sent one of my colleagues an article that I saw. Now I can't remember which news outlet it was. Shame on me. About Cool Sculpt. And I
mhm,
remember when
mhm,
I was working at a major gym chain, I'm not going to throw the name out there, and we rolled out Cool Sculpt in our spas as, oh, you could melt off your problematic fat and also it'll help you get better results somehow. And now we're finding that it's having all of these adverse health effects.
mm,
And so I hear what you're saying about the way that fitness, wellness, and certainly beauty is being rolled up into the wellness space, and exploring the lines of, well, when is it then to our detriment to wellness because we
mm,
took the beauty thing too far or the fitness thing too far, and what's our actual priority as individuals, as practitioners, and as marketers, right? Because that's one of the big arguments as well. You can't sell it if we don't make it sexy. Um,
mhm,
like you
mhm.
said, the chocolate on the broccoli.
I mean, I love broccoli.
I do too.
So,
I do too.
um, but sometimes you need a little incentive. And I mean, it's actually, yeah, a few things come to mind, which is, so on one hand, as I was reporting my book, I heard from so many women, particularly women who are now like in their 70s or 80s, who first started exercising and moving because of an aesthetic goal, something like a reunion, or having had a baby and wanting to look the way they did before. But the more that they moved, the more they discovered these profound benefits, and that's what has kept them moving for decades. So I think for a lot of people, this really clear cut incentive of changing the way they look to meet a socially acceptable ideal is it's a powerful incentive to get them started. um, but then yeah, as you said, I mean, something that I think about often is, you know there's now there's a substantial body of research and science that speaks to the mental health benefits of exercise and the chemical processes, that happen when we move, of course. um, but when and I'll speak specifically about women here, but it really applies to everybody. When women are moving with a specific aesthetic goal in mind, it's so easy to feel guilt and shame and feelings that actually blunt some of those mental health benefits. So it's this slippery slope. It's for some people, working out with aesthetic goals in mind can be perfectly healthy, and depending on your environment and everyone's sort of individual set of circumstances, it can also sort of have the opposite effect and make exercise and movement feel punitive.
Yeah, one of the phrases I like is, the three horsemen of the motivation apocalypse is shame, blame, and guilt.
Mm,
And we don't want to internalize that nonsense, right? And so when we start to wander down that train of thought, and I think what I hear you saying, and especially I noticed it in the book when you're talking about the 80s and fad fitness and the
Mm.
way in which it was being marketed, that it was being marketed a very particular aesthetic that then
Mhm.
carried into
Mhm.
the 90s. And so, especially Jane Fonda, you've got a great section in the book about Jane Fonda, and we'll talk about the VCRs in a second. But it's like, okay, if I work out like Jane Fonda, I'll look like Jane Fonda. But what I don't know is, her eating disorder and her exercise addiction and all of the pain and suffering that Jane Fonda, we now know, was having at that point in her life.
Mhm.
But we're just
Mhm.
looking at the aesthetic, being marketed the aesthetic. And when you don't end up looking that way, the way that then gets twisted into some kind of failing of personal responsibility. Like, oh, you just must not have had the willpower if you don't look like Jane Fonda now.
Yeah, you nailed it. Yeah. And I always think about Jane because, even Jane Fonda struggled to look like Jane Fonda.
Yeah.
Um, and I know there are countless women who, particularly, as the home workout VHS boom was taking off, would finish a workout and then look in the mirror and just feel this sinking sense of disappointment and, like you said, just sort of personal failure. Um, and there was also part of that is there were these other sort of cultural forces taking hold throughout the 80s, that began to associate fitness and a fit body and a body that devoted time to working out with these sort of more holistic virtues, like, a fit body was a moral body, was a correct body. And so, when you look at the flip side of that, those who had bodies, who didn't look like this very narrow and, for most people, like unattainable ideal, it was so, all of these negative characteristics could be applied, and it was and continues to be so unjust. And I I would say another major goal of mine in this with this project was just to highlight that we have been so conditioned to um, attribute one's exterior and physical self and fitness level to kind of personal responsibility, willpower, like you said. Jane Fonda's mantra was discipline is liberation, so self-discipline. When in reality, there is so much more to it than that,
Yes.
both culturally, genetically, on every level. And so it's time that we saw that for what it is, and again, try to work toward separating them.
Yeah, again, you are spot on to missions that we have been aligned on in this show. And for the listener, if you want to dive deeper on those topics, listen to either of the episodes of Rich Fahmy. There's one back in January. There's one just 2 weeks ago on fat bias and the current evidence on fat bias. There's so many ways that social production of virtue and value have been turned into a moral framework that is
Mm-hmm.
affecting the decisions that we all make. So you're listening to the Better Than Fine podcast. I'm Darlene Marshall. Danielle Friedman is my guest. And her book is Let's Get Physical, How Women Discovered Exercise and Reshaped the World. And personally, I absolutely loved each of these figures, the way in which you framed and explored them. Another theme that I noticed in the book was kind of this cycle of fad and burnout, and the way that, one extreme type of exercise would get pushed, and then we'd kind of pull back from that and push another. So, in the 80s, people wanted to get thick and curvy in the right places, not the wrong places. No, no, no. The 90s, we saw a pull back and kind of the Twiggy culture, then a resurgence in female weightlifting with CrossFit. One of the things that I think about is how do we bring any kind of holistic balance to all this when so much of it is the marketing machine? And I'm very curious, how do you think that we find balance when you've been looking at this on a much larger time scale than I certainly ever had before reading your work?
Mm. Yeah, great question. Well, I am heartened by where we are today, by
That's
how
good to
far
hear.
we've come. And I actually think that in some ways the pandemic and, the intense quarantine period of the pandemic, um, actually did help to kind of take things down a notch and help a lot of people connect with the kind of movement that actually felt good for them.
Mm.
Um, People were moving, it's kind of like dance like no one's watching. We're working out like no one was watching, because in many cases
They're not.
they weren't. And once you removed that sort of performative aspect, I think it did help people just find a new appreciation and for movement and reconnect with what actually felt good for them. I mean, um, it was one sort of trend I think that we saw come out of the pandemic. Um, I've also, just in the past few years, there has definitely been a shift, thanks in part to the work that people like you are doing,
Mm.
toward um, just celebrating movement, uh, just without it having to be this sort of all-consuming, consumer-driven, fitness
Yeah.
lifestyle. Um, I think the rise of walking, which is I am now hearing about, it's like it has
You
not
are the
stopped.
You're the
Yeah.
third journalist to bring up walking with me so far this year, and it just makes my heart grow because it's one of the things that I really push. Like, as a fitness person with a chronic illness
Yes.
who, my nervous system has a really hard time re-regulating, and discovering the mental health benefits of walking that have then trickled into so many other things. Like, it makes me smile to hear you be like, yeah, walking, woo.
Well, it started, I mean, with a personal rediscovery of walking, and I live in New York City, so I literally just can step outside my apartment, and I'm fortunate to live in an area where I can step outside my apartment and walk, safely and through the streets, basically. But I rediscovered walking during the pandemic, and I'm also I just had my second child, and so throughout pregnancy and now postpartum, it has been such a godsend to me. I think a number of years back, I if I intended to go for a run on a given day and it didn't work out for whatever reason, like I was too tired, I didn't have time, I would just basically do nothing. And now I think, I recognize that it doesn't have to be what we had been told was sort of a traditional workout to
Yeah.
count for our health, well-being, fitness level. And that was really a revelation for me. And it's something that it's just so interesting, because I really felt like I discovered that personally, but I've also, as a journalist, been hearing it from so
Yep.
many sources. So yeah, I guess I should just add that heading into the pandemic, we were coming out of this period, or had been in this period of extreme, I would call it self-optimization,
Yes.
fueled largely by millennials, and just this idea that like everything kind of had to be work and we had to be productive. And so um, for a lot of people, escaping that mentality and relearning how to move in a way that feels good, I think at least has brought us closer toward finding that balance that you pointed to.
Yeah, last week's episode led its way into talking about I hate the idea of optimization of everything.
Mm.
Self optimization, I think, is a recipe for misery. It's the opposite of well being, which of course is the purview in positive psychology. And I also discovered walking during lockdown. I was living in Brooklyn, in Park Slope, and got COVID first wave, ended up with COVID pneumonia, couldn't run, could barely lift, could
Mm.
barely make it up the stairs. But I was reading, Joy of Movement is on the shelf right there. I was reading Joy of Movement, Kelly McGonigal's book. And I was like, okay, if I want to get through this and be more resilient emotionally, regardless of what happens to all of us, then I at least need to keep my step count up, even if it can't be a run, while my lungs were still healing. So it's interesting how many of us were getting that message, whether organically or influenced by somebody's work. And now it's starting to be this next wave, fingers crossed. Because I think, in addition to what you were saying about self-optimization, I feel like there was also a trend pre-pandemic of everything was high intensity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
CrossFit and Tabata, and just every class was, at one point I was managing a training team in Soho, and the Saturday morning group fitness classes and the number of women who would faint
Oh my
every Saturday
gosh.
morning, in Soho, because they'd come in and work out without having eaten and having gone
Mm,
out the night before.
mm.
And they felt like for the workout to count, to make up for the night before, well, they'd like literally pass out.
Wow.
And just moving away from the idea that it's all supposed to be overwhelming and overstimulating and wear us down when it's actually supposed to build us up. So I'm glad to hear that you're heartened by all of that too.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I just, something that and actually, yeah, just to have I mean, as you've mentioned, I'm a fellow Kelly McGonigal
Yes.
fangirl. So to have that
Let's go.
McGonigal moment, um, something that she writes about in The Joy of Movement, and that I have to even remind myself of, is that um, there's a place for all kinds of movement. So I personally love that walking feels like a gentler form of movement for me, and I've been in maybe a season of my life where that is what I need. But for I think having that option also helps people kind of recognize, and this is what she writes about, that like working hard can also be joyful, and it's not that it has to be gentle for it to um sort of make us happy,
Yeah.
it's and so, but I think, like you were saying, because just a few years back, so many of the popular workouts were about pushing yourself to your absolute limit. It didn't feel like as much of a choice. And now being able to say, okay, what I need right now is this type of movement, or, and maybe that's gentle, or what I need right now is to show myself that I can do something that's really hard and train and, you know, um, strive toward a goal. It's just having that choice, I think, serves us all better.
Love it. Couldn't have said it better. So you profile in your book many inspirational, influential, we talked about controversial women, and I'm very curious to hear, do you have a favorite? Who is it and why?
Yeah, I always feel like this is like having to choose which of your children you love most. I mean, in bringing these women's stories to life, I really try to put myself in their shoes, and sort of understand their viewpoint, and so I have a lot of empathy for these women, even the ones, there were some, like I said, there were
I
some
had a
very
few moments. I had a few
yeah,
moments.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Put
Some
the book down and walk away.
flawed figures.
Yeah.
um, I I mean, this might be an unsatisfying answer, but because there's like a few.
Yeah, don't
But
do it to please me. Tell me what's real.
I will say, I developed such a new and deeper appreciation for Jane Fonda, and
Yeah.
for um sort of what, just how fascinating and complex a life she has lived, and what she accomplished in the fitness industry. And also, I got a sense for how she is someone who with time has not been afraid to sort of own up to her blind spots, her shortcomings. She's constantly evolving to this day. So that was definitely a privilege to write about Jane, and I interviewed as many of the as many members of her inner circle from her fitness days as possible, and it was just fascinating. But I also, and again, this is just, if I would go through each figure and explain why, something about them made them my favorite. But Judy Shepherd Missett, who invented jazzercise, um, is just such a delight, and I absolutely loved going back and watching old jazzercise workouts. She put out a number of, also very popular VHS tapes, starting in the early 80s. And I highly recommend looking them up on YouTube, and they will just, it is just impossible not to smile. They're just like, it's just sort of joy personified. Goofy and kitschy by today's standards, but amazing.
In the best way possible.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I really appreciated, kind of piggybacking on those two examples, is, as a trainer who worked with people with chronic illness and, a lot of corrective exercise and strength for function. And I at certain times in my career have been someone who've really like poo-pooed group exercises, not serious
Mm.
enough and not like whatever enough. And probably until I read Kelly's book, also had a similar view of like, well, that's not real fitness. That's just fun, which is one, super dismissive and judgy of me. But two, I really came to appreciate how in these modalities that in the past I've been judgmental of, had greater impact than I was giving them credit for. And also, in many ways, were paving the way for what I do now. Because what I do now wouldn't be considered mainstream enough or accessible enough if they weren't doing what they were doing then. And one, to just call myself out and in, but also to give that nod and of appreciation that I know I'm not the only one, because I certainly had plenty of colleagues who kind of did the same stuff, and that all forms of fitness are valid for whatever reason someone's doing it for themselves. And I think we're starting to see this trend curve back, but the like, okay, this is the right way to fitness
Mm-hmm.
is actually helpful for all of us, and probably not even for the people that they're having that thought in the first place. I don't know if you've had a similar reaction or journey at any point. But I just also like thank you for that, because it was a paradigm reframe for me and I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, well, it was definitely eye-opening for me too, to discover that, at certain points in our history, um, having a space where, basically a female only space where women focused on moving their bodies in ways that felt good and made them feel strong was actually quite radical. And so that was a learning process for me too. And I've really thought hard about my own experiences in group fitness, and I've had some experiences that were not so great, where I felt very self-conscious, and I did not have any of that sense of community, or as Kelly writes about, that kind of wonderful moving in unison, boundary
Yes.
dissolving,
Nope.
rapturous moment. And But then I have had the the flip side of that experience, and it's been wonderful. And I always think about I actually think about my mom, who is 74, and well, I write in the book that one of my earliest life memories was accompanying her to aerobics in the
Yep.
early 80s, and sitting in the babysitting area while like Whitney Houston blasted. I learned in sort of talking with my mom that those classes were vital to her well-being during that time. But then, just about, I think, 5 or 6 years ago, my mom rediscovered group dance classes and has been going at it this whole time. And through those classes has made a whole new group of friends, it has kept her strong. And I think it's very easy to poo-poo, particularly when it's a women's group
Yeah.
fitness class. But for so many people, the benefits are very real.
Yeah. Yeah. Everything you just said. One, I'm so glad that your mom has that outlet. And to your point, like, oh, why am I poo-pooing the jazzercise or the Zumba? Right? It's a status thing. And it
Totally.
definitely has to do with gender. So Danielle, thank you so much for taking the time. I know that you're very busy in your schedule. Where might people find your work? Where can we find you on the interwebs these days?
Yes, you can find me on Instagram at Danielle Friedman Writes. I share all of my recent work, as well as a lot of fun archival fitness history artifacts. And I'm on Twitter at @dfriedmanwrites. You can check out my work in the New York Times as well section, where I often write about fitness. And my book, Let's Get Physical, is available pretty much wherever books are sold, as they say.
And I will give it the, I don't know, thumbs up, I suppose, of approval. I found it insightful and challenging in all the right ways. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you so much, Darlene. This has been wonderful.
So if you are interested in supporting clients and making sustainable change in their wellness, their fitness, their well-being, well, listen up, because the National Academy of Sports Medicine, NASM, who produces this show, has a wellness coaching certification that was built by experts, people like me and Kelly McGonigal, who we keep fangirling. And we're experts in stress and coaching and neuroscience, movement, sleep, positive psychology. It is one of the things I've been very proud of and privileged to work on. And if you want to help people make sustainable, positive change instead of just telling them what to do, well, I've got a little gift for you. The certification is currently 50% off on NASM's website, but listeners to this show can get an additional $600 off. Yes, you heard me right. With the code Marshall, CWC, MARSHALLCWC. Go to NASM.org, click wellness at the top. You're going to use that promo code. It's Marshall CWC, additional $600 off. I would love to hear your feedback about this show. So if you want to reach me, you can find me. My email is info@darlene.coach. I am on Instagram. It's also darlene.coach. I do check my DMs, so go ahead and send them to me. Or you can find me on LinkedIn. There's also a Substack. It's coachdar.substack.com, where you can find ways to apply these practices in your life. If you're a fan of the show, I hope you subscribe. Thank you to everyone who's been writing us a review. Go ahead and share the show, like this, tag me when you share so I can continue to trumpet that, because that's how audiences grow. Thank you so much for being a listener to Better Than Fine, and be well.